Hello, and welcome to White Feather Counsel of Men. We are proud and happy that you're with us this evening. And I am Philip White, and this is,
Warren Hammonds.
and we are so
Nice
excited.
to have you.
Nice to have you with us this evening. We are so excited that you took the time to not find it robbery of your time to join us this evening as we unpack another subject that we feel is very important under this whole title in regard to Counsel of Men. And this evening, we're going to unpack a subject that's very personal to Warren and myself as being parents. I am a parent of my firstborn was a male. That's my son, and my secondborn is my daughter. And Warren, you have two children as well, right?
I do.
Yes.
And they are twins, so I don't want to say which one was firstborn and secondborn, although my son beat her by 1 minute or something into the world. But my twins are about 35 years old now.
That's great. That's great. I did not know they were twins.
Boy, girl, yes.
I'm learning something every day with Warren. I tell you, yes. And we've been very focused on the whole socialization process of boys that turn into men, and just how that process, the term called man in the box, and that whole socialization process, how it benefits or how it may be challenging for boys and men, just based on the parenting of boys in particular, and societal in regard to some of the significant issues that we are facing around violence and power and control and privilege. It kind of fits into that camp, in regard to just boys and men. So Warren and I, we've been talking all week leading up to this session about how we want to unpack the certain privileges, certain freedoms that we seem to give our sons, and it's not done to try to cause harm later on in life, but it's just one of those things that each of us, as we talk about our parenting and being dads, that and I think for most men, when they find out that the mother is carrying a son, it kind of elevates their excitement, and it's been and Warren did some excellent research in regard that particular anticipation is spiritually based. It is throughout the Bible, and as we follow those traditions in regard to the having a son, and Warren's going to speak to that. Somehow there's a higher level of excitement having a son versus having a daughter. Now it's interesting when you got twins because they're right there together. So yeah, that's an emotional piece there. What you think, Warren?
I don't know if we want to get into how we parent. What my comment earlier this week with the biblical relevance was just to bring about that even in biblical cultural times, even in biblical times, there was a cultural difference as to how boys were treated over the daughters, maybe more intentionally then, at least in some regard, given priority and preeminence in the family and the best of the inheritance, if there was any. Some of that made sense because the eldest son was responsible at some point for caring for his mother if his father died, until her death. And so that put a responsibility on that son or on a son. So even from generation to generation back, eons back, there may have been this cultural difference of the expectations that we place on our sons and not on our daughters. And therefore we might, again, as you said, not necessarily intentionally, but maybe somehow just because it's in our culture, sort of the norm, we don't embrace it necessarily intentionally, but it's part of what we do. We may not even know we treat them differently. My wife and I tried desperately not to treat Brett and Emily really any differently, but of course they're different. Yeah. So you treat children differently because they have different experiences. They had different friends. They were different genders. But we intentionally didn't set them up like, hey, Brett, you can't play with dolls, or Emily, you ought to play with dolls. We're intentional about not making those grand kind of expectations or assumptions that would be different. when they were in middle and high school, they both became interested in track and field together, so they were involved in similar things. Early on in sports, Brett was involved more in sort of the rougher sports of, not really rough, but at least baseball and soccer. And my daughter didn't care too much for that. And I don't think it was how we raised her, but maybe without us knowing, it was messages that we were given. But I remember early on in my own childhood, I feel graced that my parents raised me with the ideas that it was okay to cry as a male. And sometimes that's one of the cultural norms. Hey, don't cry. Don't show your emotions as much. I'm now wearing pink tonight, saying that, hey, men can wear pink.
That's right.
We don't always have to stay in that. We don't always have to stay in that stereotype of what's appropriate for girls and boys. So we tried very intentionally not to raise our son differently than we did our daughter, but we might have. We might have responded to him differently with emotional needs or to her. And again, it wasn't all intentional, but I think some of that is just the way our culture is built. I did a little bit of reading in Psychology Today recently, and they actually said, while parents may not intend to treat sons and daughters differently, research shows that they do. So the question is, why do we continue to do that? And maybe what harm does it do long term, if any harm, or does it help or hurt? So it just brings up some questions.
Yeah. Well, how do you think we treat them different? What kind of things we do that kind of come to your mind?
Well, I'm not really sure. We tried not to, but I know that if I were to choose whether to roughhouse with my son or daughter, I probably would have chosen Brett. Was that intentional because he's a male? I don't know. But the other thing that this article that I was reading recently in Psychology Today says is one of the major findings is that dads of daughters seem to be more attentive and responsive to their child's needs, speak more openly about the emotions to that daughter than they would the son, and even sing more to their little one if they're a daughter, while dads of sons may be much more likely to engage in rough and tumble play.
Yeah.
So we are already orchestrating that more aggressive nature, that be a man kind of message, even though we may not say the words. So those are some of the ways that we might influence or continue the patterns of our culture and the differences of how we raise men and boys, and it just or boys and girls, and it just calls into question what difference down the road does that make? Because of course we see that so many men now are the more violent perpetrators. What has caused that? Is it just our parenting in these little ways, or of course that doesn't, you can't make that connection that clearly, but those are some of the questions that we're left with.
And, one of the major social challenges we have in America when it comes to raising boys, that so many boys are growing up without their fathers, and that gives us that tag called the father wound. And it's real. It is a significant absence in boys' lives when they grow up without their biological father. Now, some boys could be fortunate and have a stepfather that comes in and is taking over that role as being a father, which is great, which is absolutely great. But there's still that sense of that hole that child knows. Yeah, my stepfather has been there, but I don't know my father. I don't know my biological father. And that can be a haunting type of situation that a lot of men struggle with. And if they aren't careful and really try to unpack that to go, and I remember doing group, when I would do group a lot with men, is to ask them, well, go back to your elders, go back to your mother and your grandparents, and your father might be living 2 blocks away. They just never told you. And you may need to step to him, and he may be afraid to step to you because of that absence, and that's real. And when we talk about that absent father, and the government over the years has allowed grants to be funded out to all kinds of fatherhood work under that title of trying to address children who are growing up without their father. And one of the biggest challenges in our country that has separated a lot of fathers from their children is a high rate of incarceration. You see, and that's another factor. It's a side issue, but it's an important issue. Is how we try to bond children, particularly boys, to their father. Even if there's incarceration, can that young man still develop a functional, healthy relationship with his father who may be incarcerated? Sure, he can, but it's going to take some work, and it's going to take a significant amount of support. We we want to show you when we talk about life as a whole and where we start and on our birth. We had this wonderful picture we came up with, and it shows this infant, this child that's in the biblical sack, in the sack inside the mother. And I've always felt that there's a place when we talk about life and parents, fathers and mothers, that fathers have to be intentionally understanding of that relationship that mothers can develop with a child while she is carrying the child. That's a special moment for women, and it can be a very personal, internal relationship with this infant that she can feel the kick, she can feel the movement, and as fathers, we can't have that feeling because we don't give birth. And our parenting of children, start when the child is born. And if we're in there when the child is born, hopefully we can, as a tradition, we can cut the umbilical cord and hold the child and see our child at birth at that moment. Very interesting thing happened to me the other day. I was watching this National Geographic program, and they were showing this mother elephant. She was pregnant, and she was getting ready to give birth, and they shot the screen. They brought it right close to her cavity where the baby elephant was coming out, and the baby fell out, and all this fluids fell out of the mother, and the baby hit the ground. This is a baby elephant being born, and the baby rolled over twice and then stood up on all four, and it was raining, and all the other female elephants gathered around this little infant to protect the infant from the rain. And I was amazed at that and how though they took care of that. But what was amazing is how that elephant, that little baby elephant, she rolled over two times and then stood up and started taking these steps, trying to get them moving on walking, because standing up for animals in the wild is part of survival. And I thought about how different that is for our children, when they are born, and we have to care for them. It takes them a while before they start to walk and be able to stand up and run. It's just various stages, and our involvement with our children starts. It's longer as far as our full development that it takes, and that a father, like Warren has said, what role we play as it relates to our daughters versus our sons can be significantly different. Dr. Joy, Joy DeGrew, she has done a lot of work in regard to trauma, in regard to slavery and trauma. But I watched her on a podcast not long ago, and she was talking about how there's a problem with our sons because we stop touching our sons at a certain age. We stop hugging them, and we stop touching them. We stop kissing them at an age that's in their teens. We stop with that, and that could be an issue when it comes to just the amount of affection or the lack of affections that we show our sons. Warren and I talk a lot about that we should encourage our sons if they're having some issue, if they're sad, if they're grieving something, if they lost a friend. We should be in a place to let them have that grief. If they start to cry, let them cry. If they feel down and depressed, let's talk about that. Let's be close to our sons, rather than tell them that term that we don't particularly like, and that man up term, which we don't know what it really means. We just use it as something you're supposed to get to or overcome. But is that really helping us, in an emotional state when we talk about our sons? So we have to be extremely careful. But this picture of the birth really just talks about how fragile we are at birth. We're very fragile, and it's over time that we begin to develop that sense of strength and mobility and closeness to our parents. And one of the things Warren and I was talking about is that, children be around us, and if you're not careful as a parent, particularly as a dad, your children can pick up your kind of behaviors and your voice tone and everything about you, that they may know more about you than you know about yourself. So we do play a critical role. We have a significant role to play.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Phil, that you mentioned the fathering aspect, that maybe when they become boys become a little bit older, we might withdraw unintentionally or whatever. So it leads right into another article that I was reading, and it's from Psychology Today as well, a little bit early, just in 2022. But research, I'll quote on this, research suggests that positive time, and they were answering the question, by the way, what sons need from their fathers, present fathers, and effective fathers. Research suggests that positive time spent with their fathers can reduce the likelihood of boys becoming anxious, depressed, or aggressive. And then it says boys also crave warmth, affection, and tenderness from their fathers. I think that might be one of the ways that we do differentiate. Maybe fathers are more comfortable giving that warmth and affection and tenderness to a daughter, or maybe thinking that the son doesn't need it as much, or we draw back. So those are just some things to think about.
Yeah.
But I think you were going to show a next thought.
Yeah, we came across this picture titled "Thoughts," and it showed this father with his two children. They're holding hands, and he's walking across the street when he have in his hand a tricycle. I think this picture was shot probably, I don't know what city. I think it was in New York when they were walking across the street. But the last sentence in this particular article speaking that the end product of child raising is not the child but the parent. And my interpretation of that sentence there is that as a parent, you are constantly in a stage of change. Constantly changing with your children. You cannot expect to be an effective parent, dad, if you still treating your children like when they were
6 years old.
6 years old. Right. Now they 13, and you still treating them like they're 6. You can't do that. Your child's gonna find some other way to keep you at distance, because you have to make changes along the developmental stage of your children. You have to be able to make that shift, and that's a major requirement. And when we think about our boys, and particularly as dads, we have to be extremely careful that we don't try to make them to be us. They are in their own space with their own dreams and ideas and thoughts, and I think. And it's no slight with what I'm about to say here, but I think when we name our boys, and if we give our boys our names, if my son is Philip A. White Jr., that's okay. But I don't want him to lose his identity as an individual. You see. We didn't name.
Yeah, does that put the pressure on him becoming a remake of you?
Yeah, you're right. I think sometimes when we name our, and I guess it's tradition, so sometimes you can have generations.
Yeah,
of
the third, the
fourth, and just go on and on. And there's nothing wrong with it, but we don't want to, you're right, we don't want to expect the son to go into the same type of occupation that I'm doing, or attend the same church that I'm going, or just follow my footsteps, so to speak. Some do, And that can be a positive outcome, but some may choose to go in a whole different direction, and that's okay as well. But we have to give our sons that space to kind of develop their own path, their own career goals, and be supportive of that. Be very, very supportive of that. When you talk about your children, because my two kids, my daughter was probably well, they both were very active in soccer. They played a lot of soccer with travel teams and traveling all around the world, not the world, but around the country, playing travel soccer and all. And my daughter, she when she see Aaron, he tipped off into music. He went on to play in the band in high school. But Lauren continued in soccer and played in high school, and then went on to college and played college soccer. So they had they went in different paths as far as that. But the most consistent thing they had, as most what we want to do as parents, is be present. It was nothing that they were doing where mom and dad, one of us was there, if not both, all the time. And I think that's the most effective thing that we can give our children, is that presence, and let them develop, in whatever scope they may want to go into. And so I think it's as we try to unpack this thing about when we look at this whole social issue of violence and social problems that we have, and it seems to always fall in the camp of boys and men, that how far back can we go, in regard to our raising of boys, and how there's a split between boys and girls when they get a certain age as far as the maturity level goes. And boys seem to get older. Warren and I was talking coming in about the middle school problem, that boys start to show some academic challenges by the time they get to middle school. And a certain percentage of boys, by the time they're in middle school, may do poorly in high school, and a certain percentage of that group may drop out of high school. And a percentage of those that drop out may end up in our criminal justice system. That's where we get the term from the schoolyard to the prison yard. And that is a statistical fact that is happening in our country when we talk about the middle school problem. So it's one of those things that if we as dads need to understand how important we are, if God, that we play a critical role into our children's stages of development, from that child, that toddler, that teenager into that young adulthood. We were always, as dads, we're going to be dads for the rest of our lives. It doesn't stop. I don't care if my son is now, Aaron is now 36. No, he's 38. Aaron is 38. Lauren's 36. And that they still out. He's still my son. She's still my daughter. So nothing's changed about that, and we try to be there and offer counsel and advice and have fun and do things that we do. But that's something that we have to be conscious of as dad, and like Warren says, to be a nurturer as well, and to be tender and be soft and be supportive of their emotional development and their ability to communicate well, and encourage our boys to communicate very well. That's always a complaint that you heard a lot about men.
And I know you've talked a lot about it. That's what your work was involved in so many years. It's so important. You've always said of, trying to not just encourage, but affirm those kind of emotional connections, the emotional communication, getting in touch with your own feelings of boys, because, long-term consequences could be bad. We can't draw direct correlation between, if you raise a child with the message of don't show your emotions and don't talk about it and don't cry, that it leads to a, violent temper or something like that. But it does shut them down somewhat. It doesn't allow them the freedom to express in a healthy way what is going on in them. If we are always rough and aggressive with a boy, does that teach them to be more powerful or to be in control? And then what about when they're not in control? What do? Do they, tip off the scale, or, what happens then? Again, not making any direct correlation, but just the questions out there. So it brings to mind how we parent, the messages that we convey to to boys in particular, since that's our audience and that's what we are trying to discuss. But why we do that and what the consequences might be. So it just helps us to sort of think it through,
Right.
make us more conscious of ways that we relate to our sons and daughters.
That's
And I think you might try to wrap us up in a few minutes.
yeah. We this is such a, it's like I say, it's personal for us because we both are fathers. We both have two children. They now adults, but they still are children. And we talked about our parenting of these adults at this stage of their lives, and watching them go on, and you pray for them, you wish them well, and but yeah, you are a parent, and that's something you have to be able to make those adjustments throughout the period of your parenting, as particularly as they become adults, and how you interact with them, and still be that support for them, and be able to offer them advice when it's needed, so to speak. So we would love you to share your thoughts with us about this subject, and we talk about parenting children, and they get into their teenage years and then their young adulthood stage, and they go on and have their own children. That you still parenting, you still offering advice and wisdom to them, and we would love to hear from you. So please, take the time to share with us. We came across that there's a piece that we came across called "Home and Parents." that was written by
Khalil Gibran.
Khalil Gibran.
Yes.
And he's
poet and author.
Poet and author. You want to look that up. I think you will find that very, very helpful. And I just want to share the last sentence that he said in this particular poem that he wrote called "Home and Parents." And it says here, "Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness. For even as he loves the arrows that flies, which are your children, the arrows that flies, so he loves the bow that is stable." Parents are the bow. And you are sending your children forth as arrows that you want them to fly as far as they can. But the key word here is being stable as the bow. That we have to ensure that we're doing the best that we can to take care of ourselves. Emotionally, physically, spiritually, financially. Take care of ourselves to the best of our abilities. And if we find ourselves having a deficit in any of those areas, we have to have the courage and the wisdom and the transparency to get support. We are not born with all the gifts and skills that we may have as parents, but we have to be willing to get support and have support. We all need support. So that bow, as parents, we are the bow. That's going to send our children forward, and we're going to let them go. And we want to be able to let them go where they have a sense of security, a sense of confidence in their abilities, in their wisdom, and their tenacity to go forth and pray that they do well in whatever they choose to do. Like I say, it's not our task to try to make them like us. If they choose to follow us in a certain way, so be it. But if they choose to go in another way, you congratulate that, you celebrate that, and you support them in regard to that. And we want to close with this. We came across this Cherokee legend poem. Not a poem, it's more of a statement called Two Wolves. And it reads as follows. An old Cherokee is teaching his grandson about life. "A fight is going on inside me," he said to the boy. "It is a terrible fight, and is between two wolves. One is evil. He is angry. He is envy, sorrow, regrets, greed, arrogance, self-pity, grief, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego." He continues. "The other is good. It is joy, peace, love, hope, sincerity, humility, kindness, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. The same fight is going on inside you and inside every other person too. The grandson thought about it for a minute and then asked the grandfather, which wolf will win? The old Cherokee simply replied, the one you feed. And that's what we want to end this with saying that be careful, parents, in regard to what we share with our children, how we pull in information and knowledge. It's so much information. One of my personal concern about parenting in this day and time is that we have to almost protect our children for the vast amount of information that they can get from so many multiple sources. If our 6-year-old and our 10-year-old and our 13-year-old or 15-year-old, if they have cell phones, they are subject to all kinds of information, So when we talk about feeding our children information, part of our task is to protect them as well from certain information. So it's dual role. You want them to be knowledgeable about their culture and educational things, but we also have to be protective of some information that may be filtered their way. And that's just part of where we have to look at now as far as raising children. You know, it's almost like their childhood is always in jeopardy because it's just such information that is right at their fingertips. And us as parents, we got to be the gatekeepers. We got to be the gatekeepers and make sure we do our best job to protect their innocence and give them cover. Give them cover from certain things that may do more harm than good. So that's our session for this evening. We hope something that stimulated you to think about this thing and for as your own parenting and have that discussion with your friends and other family members in regard to how we parenting boys in particular, because our research clearly shows that there's a correlation in regard to these early stages of development and the relationships that the male child can have with family, particularly as that child grows from a boy to a teenager to an adult. There can be various factors that can send him one way or the other, and we want to be careful because we have to take ownership for the number of our boys and men that are resulting to violence to deal with their personal issues. You know, just it doesn't make sense, but it is what it is, and whatever we can do to add a little light to these issues that we're facing in the country, hopefully it can make parents just start to think a little different in regard to how you're raising little Johnny who's now 6 and how Johnny's going to be when he's 16, when he's 26, when he's 36. Just start thinking about that. So we thank you for being with us tonight, Warren.
No, I don't have anything to add. I'll just sign off very quickly just to remind you that in 2 weeks we'll be back. I believe that's June the 7th. Mm-hmm. We do appreciate you being with us and sharing your time with us. You are always encouraged to reply to our sessions. You can do that outside of the live session that you might be listening to by going through our email account, Gmail. It's wfcounselofmen@gmail.com, and we will occasionally look at that to see what comments are brought forward. In fact, we plan to have a session in several weeks regarding some comments that have been shared over the last couple of sessions or in response to some that have already been loaded on our channel. So thanks for your attendance tonight, and we'll see you in 2 weeks on June the 7th.
Good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.